a dash of courage, a pinch of hope, a tisp of spice to keep us woke. Let the fire burn and rise, and bring revolution from the skies. A pinch of Lenin, a little Marx, a touch of Bakunin to heal the scars. Let anarchy be born again, and heal the world of all the pain. The patient seems to have slipped into some kind of delusion and developed a second persona molded around the archetype of the witch. It's a clear cry for help and a desperate attempt to create a false sense of agency and power. It's become totally clear that she's ventured beyond my professional capacity. Angie has in fact gone stark, raving mad. Hello darlings, and welcome to a very special spooky episode of Angie Speaks. Today we're going to be discussing the politics of witchcraft, the archetype of the witch, and why the witch has once again become a symbol of empowerment for people all over the world in the 21st century. So stick around and let's get witchy. The witch has always been a touchstone feature of mythology and folklore, but its roots, iconography, and essence reach back to the early pagan cultures of the world. The domains of women, and all that was associated with the feminine principle, is where the archetype found its footing. In early human societies, the earth itself was personified as feminine because of its reproductive, protective, and yielding powers. Earth goddesses and primordial mothers were the first religious figures of mankind, and reverence for the divine aspects of the feminine principle flourished. Women were seen as conduits of this divine force, and many became counselors, priestesses, and healers. The advancement of agriculture brought the feminine principle of the earth under the control of man. And for the first time, people were able to harness the reproductive powers of the earth, and this allowed for the creation of city-states and societies. During this period, a myriad of male deities began to spring up along with the advent of agriculture, and they started to take the place that was once reserved for the earth goddess. Women's divinity and spirituality was still revered, but the powers of the goddess were largely limited to the traditional domains of women. There were a few exceptions to this rule, of course, but as the role the earth once played in the lives of humans changed, the domain of women shifted alongside it. The religious and domestic roles of women became centered around the art of healing, midwifery, abortion, counsel, and other family matters. Women acted as the first physicians, and they had the power to both heal and poison. This was when the archetype of the witch started to take form as the wise woman or the cunning woman. They passed their medical and herbal knowledge down from mother to daughter and established strong traditions, and in some cases they even established secret societies. The spread of Christianity devastated women's power, autonomy, and spirituality, as most of the old ways soon became associated with Satanism and the devil. All of the archetypes of the primordial mother were absorbed into Mary, the mother of Christ, and subordinated under the power of the church. As medical knowledge became institutionalized within the male clergy, women who practiced healing arts were branded as witches and persecuted by the church and the state. Across medieval Europe, there were laws that prohibited women from healing because the power of the wise woman was deeply at odds with the power of the clergy and the state. Priests were angered by the acclaim and respect that was given to the wise woman, as they believed this honor was reserved for God alone. If the wise woman could heal, she could also maim. If she could aid in the deliverance of life into the world through midwifery, then she could also take it away. The church saw these practices as interfering with the domain of God, and were deeply suspicious of the power these women wielded over life and death. Midwifery was outlawed, along with all the old pagan practices that eased women's pain and brought comfort during childbirth. The church believed that it was a woman's duty to endure a painful labor because they believed that this was the curse that Eve placed upon all women. All the old reservoirs of feminine power were denigrated and demonized. The conical hat that was once associated with healing now became a sign of evil. The old crone that was once seen as a symbol of wisdom and comfort was now called hag and spat upon. Women were completely stripped of their roles as healers, counselors, and pillars of the community, and these domains were now handed over to men. Women who practiced medicine, midwifery, or healing without special permission from the church or state were branded charlatans, heathens, and witches, and many of them were executed for this crime. Despite this, small reservoirs of feminine power continue to flourish in places like villages and small rural communities. There were women who still remembered the old ways and practiced in secret, even some who remembered the goddesses of old and drew inspiration from their images. But when the burning times came, these women were massacred, along with their daughters, mothers, and sisters. During the Christianization of Europe, the Church of Rome set up its Inquisition. Those who did not toe the line of Orthodox Christianity were charged with heresy. Out of these religious persecutions came the witch hunts, which some have called the Women's Holocaust. 85% of those killed for the crime of witchcraft in Europe during this period were in fact women. This all occurred between the 15th and 17th centuries, and later on during European colonial conquest, the murders continued as Christians came into contact with pagan and animist cultures. The feminine principle was dethroned, and in her place stood the haggard, malevolent figure of the witch. Women's power was now associated with evil and death. The Renaissance brought with it a new witch craze, and the witch became a figure of female evil in paintings, stories, and folklore. She was no longer a healer, but a hexer. No longer a teacher, but a deceiver. No longer did she commune with the spirits of nature, but consorted with the devil and performed unspeakable rites. No longer a protector of children, but a consumer of children. This monstrous version of the once revered feminine forces of nature became solidly personified within the cultural canon. We have been taught by our culture to fear the witch, but somehow we still always seem to be drawn to her power. The systems of learning that women had cultivated for themselves throughout the ages were heavily suppressed by the church and the state because it had political implications. The word witch brought to mind ideas about women's power, and underneath patriarchal societies, ones that dwelled underneath the domain of the father-god archetype, this posed a formidable threat. The autonomy of women, their ability to meet in groups, their reproductive freedom, and their control over their sexuality. These things were all seen as contrary to the goals of civilization. The witch burnings were a way to take control of women's powers over reproduction, including sexuality, midwifery, contraception, and abortion. This all contributed to the domestication of Western women that took place over hundreds of years. If women could control their bodies by controlling their fertility, then the state could not use them to produce the workers and soldiers that were needed for expansion. The relationship between peoples and their lands was a deeply spiritual and political relationship too. The witch craze was responsible for the destruction of this relationship, as feudal peasants who who relied on the earth for sustenance were forced off their land due to enclosures by feudal landlords. This destroyed thousands of years of history, kept safe in the oral traditions and folk culture of these communities. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, trade expanded around Europe and landowners pressed for the confiscation of peasant land. Feudal peasants were driven off their land and into cities and towns, and this caused uproar. Stories about pagan rebellions against feudal incursions were written about by church officials, and the peasants were said to have drawn strength from land spirits and the arcane gods and goddesses of nature. Many of these rebellions were also organized and led by women. The church responded to this by branding all those who resisted the new feudal order as enemies of God and charged them with witchcraft. The enclosure of land through the feudal system and the new economies that were created through the witch trials culminated into the system of capitalism and private ownership that we know today. None of it would have been possible if it were not for the land enclosures and the subjugation of women. As feudalism flourished, repression increased. Beggars, foreigners, widows, elderly women, unmarried women, and anyone considered mysterious or strange were all prime suspects for the crime of witchcraft. The charge of witchcraft became a catch-all way to tarnish and destroy anyone considered outside of the established order. Witchcraft has always been associated with the oppressed and groups that have been outcast from society. Many people have found refuge and comfort within this paradigm. It is a reservoir of power for the powerless, and a way of connecting to cultures that were stolen or lost or even destroyed through violence, conquest, and repression. Outside of the Western world, the word witchcraft was used by colonial powers to dismiss the religions and societies of indigenous people, most of whom practiced some form of earth-based spirituality. In cultures where the goddess remained intact, and the most important roles of women were not called into question, contact with Western civilization was culturally catastrophic. In the Western imagination, the forces of nature and the feminine principle have been heavily associated with the savage and untamed forces of nature, and the forces of conquest, industry, and civilization have been associated with the masculine principle. Cultures that revered the feminine principle were therefore seen as savage, uncivilized, and uncultivated, even though these cultures produced great art, contributed scientific knowledge, and made great discoveries. Witchcraft was a word used to control and destroy indigenous populations through the mandate of the church. And they did so by replacing their rituals, their rites, and their culture with those that were approved by the state. Despite this, the formidable old powers found new forms in syncretism. The slave and indigenous populations that were stolen and occupied in colonial regions created new forms of religion that blended the old African powers with Catholic saints. Santeria, Voodoo, Palo, and Hoodoo are examples of how African gods found a new place within these oppressive environments and aided in the emancipation of their people. The same gods that inspired the revolutionaries that overthrew the French during the Haitian Revolution. The history of witchcraft is rife with political struggle for the rights of women, a struggle against empire, oppression, and the coercive systems of organized religion and the state. There are still those today that call themselves witches. They come from all walks of life, and their belief systems vary from atheist to pantheist, from animist to agnostic. There are many different forms of witchcraft, and the word means different things to different people. The decriminalization of witchcraft has been a slow and vague process throughout the Western world, Not all practitioners consider their form of witchcraft to be religious. However, there are some sects of witchcraft that do consider themselves to be religions. For example, Wicca and Hoodoo. Although today, most are not actually recognized as religions by the state, except a few, like Wicca. Despite this, witchcraft still continues to flourish, and in recent years there has been a resurgence of renewed interest in the topic by the general public. The archetype of the witch has once again resurfaced into the public imagination. But this time, she's not really seen as the evil hag. She's seen as the independent, self-reliant person. The modern archetype of the witch is much less gender-based, because now people understand that anybody can manifest this archetype and feel drawn to its mystery and its purpose. It is no accident that in the era where the forces of industry threaten to destroy the earth, and the spectre of toxic masculinity threatens to destabilize the global political sphere, that the witch has become a symbol of empowerment for those who feel disempowered. A source of inspiration that connects women and oppressed people to a long tradition that reaches back through the ages. It is in fact a reach for power when most people find themselves feeling completely powerless. Historically, witchcraft has been the refuge of the oppressed, and people who knew that they could not rely on traditional power structures to meet their needs. The Afro-Caribbean community, indigenous people, women, and many other groups have drawn power from the archetype of the witch, yet it is a recent phenomenon among the white middle class. In many ways, capitalism has started the process of commodification and has turned the witch into a bit of a consumer identity, which I have not fallen for in any capacity. Just kind of ignore this whole setup. None of this is mine. The archetype of the witch was once mysterious and feared, and some would argue that this was part of its power. However, in recent decades, the forces of neoliberalism have watered down the potency of this archetype and turned its spiritual tools into consumable goods. There is also a trend of celebrities and other prominent figures centering themselves and gaining social capital from the newfound craze of witchcraft, while ignoring the contributions of those who have been doing the magical and political work for decades, most of whom are poor women, people of color, and other marginal people. People who are more in line with those who suffered in the witch trials and the Christian invasions. It happens in pop culture, and it even happens here on YouTube. Despite this, there are still those who adopt the archetype for spiritual and political purposes that are more aligned with the energies that it was birthed in. Those witches who still continue to fight for women's rights. Those witches who cultivate a deep love and respect for nature and who fight against the corrupted forces of industry. And those witches who fight to dismantle capitalism and empire. Witchcraft is a blueprint, a map of resistance that those who came before left to guide us through dark times and periods of uncertainty. Witchcraft is the domain of outcasts and people on the fringes of culture and consciousness, those not afraid to venture into the dark regions of the mind and bring back light. A wise person once said that there are gods who don't care how empire ends, just that it does. Let the road be made clear for those who take on the forces that threaten to destroy and erode our planet, our mother. Let the institutions that sacrifice the weak for the sake of greed crumble and implode. And let the mighty power of the feminine principle rise again. We are the witches standing at the precipice of this point in history, and together we can birth a new world. Hecate, Demeter, Yemaya, Oshun. Let these be words of power for all those in fear. Thanks so much for watching today's spooky Halloween episode of Angie Speaks. I really hope that you enjoyed yourselves. I'd like to say another huge thank you to my Patreons. Without you guys, none of this would be possible. If you would like to consider becoming a Patreon, please consider checking out the link in the description. I have a new goal up. My goals are constantly obviously renewing since I'm starting, and I'm needing all the help I can get. Thank you so much, and I shall see you next time.